My name is Elizabeth Erline, and I'm Assistant Vice President of Research and Programs at the National Health Council. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar on mHealth, digital health, and digital therapeutics, terminology, and current landscape. Next slide, please. So before we get started, I want to go through just a couple of housekeeping items. The first one is that the answer is yes, the webinar will be recorded and it'll be available on the National Health Council's website afterwards. It'll be the same website where you registered for today's session. All attendees are going to be automatically muted. You won't be able to unmute yourself during the duration of the webinar, but we will have Q&A towards the end. You can go ahead and just insert any questions into the chat function, and we will have some time to get to as many of them as we can. And then just to note that the webinar series, this is the first webinar in a series of 3, and it's being organized by the PAVE Center, which is a collaboration between the National Health Council and the University of Maryland, and the center is supported by the Pharma Foundation. Next slide, please. So I'm very excited to be joined by 2 wonderful speakers for today's session. We're joined today by Dr. Yayan Clay, who serves as Chief Scientific Officer at the Digital Medicine Society. He joined the Digital Medicine Society in 2021 as Chief Scientific Officer, and he is responsible for scientific strategy and output. He lectures on digital health at several universities and is also an editorial board member at Carger Digital Biomarkers. So thank you so much, Yayan, for joining us today. And we're also joined by Dr. Megan Coder, who serves as Chief Policy Officer at the Digital Therapeutics Alliance. She founded the Alliance in 2017 and currently leads DTA's efforts related to thought leadership, global policy, international standard development, as well as their initiative on value assessment and development of an integration guide. So we're very excited to be able to learn from both of you today. And I will turn it over to Dr. Clay to get us started.
Super, thank you so much for the introduction and welcome everybody to the webinar. I'm going to go across a few topics today, but really the aim here is just to get everybody on the same page so that we can have a good discussion later and so that you can get the most out of the following webinars. So if you jump to the next slide, I want to just start also setting a little bit in terms of who I am, where I come from, because there is an important point here. So if you jump to the next slide. So DIME, the Digital Medicine Society, we're a 501c3 nonprofit. And importantly, we really sit at the intersection of kind of the classic healthcare industry that we think of, so people who develop new medicines and products to assist those new medicines, and the tech industry. And this interface has been something that has really become more and more important over the last few years. And in the next few slides, I'll talk about why that is. But if you just jump on one more, the reason I want to start with this is because, DIME, one of our biggest assets is our community. And our community benefits from having a very broad range of perspectives and voices in it. And so we're always looking for people who come and represent different perspectives, different patient groups, different industries, etc. We would love to have you in our community, and I've included a few links here about how you can become a member or how you can reach out to us if you're interested to become part of any of our projects or initiatives, or even just to talk about what initiatives are coming up. So if we jump on one again. Good. So the 2 things that I was tasked with today is really, firstly, just to talk about the current landscape of what we mean where we are in digital health currently. And then in the second section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the definitions and some of the terminology that you're going to hear. Again, as I mentioned, really just to set you up for a good discussion later on. So if you jump on, I want to start just really giving you a sense of how quickly the field is evolving. And so if you are feeling overwhelmed by any of this, or you're not really sure where things are going, it's okay, you're not the only one. Really, so DIME was formed in late 2019. And one of the first things that we did was just really start to landscape what's out there and what people are doing. And at the time, there was around 12 sponsors actually collecting digital endpoints. And I'll come to what digital endpoints are later. But this is just part of what we talk about when we talk about digital health. And safe to say, it wasn't much. And most of them were in very early phases, but it was a start. And if you go on one more slide, you can see where we are now, less than 2 years later. There's now nearly 70 sponsors, and I think I checked the website this morning and we're over more than 300 different examples. So these are different studies using different tools. We're also seeing much more use in later phase studies, larger studies. And so this is just, as I say, just one aspect of what digital health is. And really just in the last 2 years, we've seen such an explosion of efforts across all kinds of different stakeholders and companies. And this sort of sense of excitement is really driven by what we feel digital health can bring as value for not just sponsors, but also for patients themselves. And that's actually reflected also in how much investment that we've seen in the field generally. So if you jump on one more, you can see that there has been an absolutely phenomenal investment into digital health over the last couple of years. And what we're seeing, this growth in the last couple of years, is the result of a lot of that investment. That's the fruit that is being borne. And if you jump on again, that trend is absolutely expected to continue. And so, as I say, it is a young field, but it's definitely going to be part of the future. I mean, it's already here, but it's going to become more and more part of everyday care delivery, of clinical trials, and every other aspect of healthcare delivery. If you jump on. So obviously the big boys have noticed this, and as in just the last year alone, 3 out of 5 of the biggest companies in the world have all made significant investments into health tech, into digital health. And as I say, this is part of a bigger trend. And what's important here is that these companies are bringing digital health into our everyday lives. This is no longer a specialist tool being used in clinical development, but this is something that you can buy for yourself in a lot of shops or on the internet. And you don't even have, just one device that you can choose from. You have a whole range of devices, different language supports, different budget windows. And I personally think this is a great thing. I think a lot of people are concerned about what these big companies want with this investment. But I'm confident that we have good regulation, and ultimately the clout that these companies bring, for me, most importantly, is about lowering that barrier to entry and making this available to more and more people. If you jump on one more, my optimism is, as I say, does come with a caveat, and especially in the last couple of years through the pandemic, we have seen an absolutely phenomenal rise, for example, in telehealth usage. But this positivity is not yet across the board penetrating, and so there is certainly a lot of work still to be done, but as I say, for me and my optimism, I think it's obviously going to be a big part of the future, and we need to work out together how we're going to actually plot that course. And I think this webinar here and taking part in this discussion is an important step in that, and getting engaged with what we're doing in this space. Great. So if you jump on one more, and another one, again, as I mentioned earlier, what I want to start with when we're thinking about this discussion, again, it's really important that we all just get on the same page and are using a shared lexicon, a shared vocabulary around what we're actually referring to. And this might sound simple, but it's actually been a pretty major stumbling block in the field, partly just because it has developed so quickly. But there's a lot of people, especially experts in the field, who spend all day thinking about this, will use different terms interchangeably, will not necessarily be aligned on what these terms are. So something that the DIME and DTX Alliance, who you're going to hear from later, actually worked on very early in our evolution, is just getting a very clear definition of what it actually means and what we are talking about when we talk about these things. And so I think the most important and the most foundational definition, if you were going to walk away from this talk, is really the difference between digital health, digital medicine, and digital therapeutics. And these three things are confusing because although they are very distinct categories, they all have the same goal, right? Which is ultimately to improve treatment and management of diseases. And that means, as I say, people oftentimes conflate these different terms. And so I'm just going to walk through them each individually and give you a case study so that you can start to see how these different things come together. So if you jump on one more. First, and the most all-encompassing, the sort of the biggest umbrella term is digital health, right? This is the biggest category and includes the other two, and really includes all the technologies, platforms, and systems that we use either simply to engage with people, to capture data, or to support operational aspects. This is really everything. And if you jump on, a sort of a really nice example of this, for example, is the Heartline study, which is by Johnson & Johnson. It's being run in the US. If I remember correctly, it's 150,000 people are taking part. And basically, they're just looking to see how digital health tools can improve long-term risk. And it's basically using the ECG function on the Apple Watch and a simple app. So it's people who are at risk, and it's just helping them engage with their own health and seeing if that actually improves outcomes. So this is a really nice example of what a digital health tool can do for you in your everyday life. And if you jump on one more. When we get a little bit more defined, we can think about digital medicine. And this is where these are actually evidence-based products. And this is kind of a key hurdle in the development. Many products will start out as a digital health product, and once sufficient evidence has been collected, they will become a digital medicine product. So to clarify what I mean by that, I have another case study on the next slide. So a very famous example is the stride velocity tool, which was recently qualified by the European Medicines Agency as an endpoint for use in Duchenne muscular dystrophy. This is the first digital endpoint, so the first outcome captured by a digital tool that's actually been qualified for use by any regulatory body. And so it's a huge milestone in the development of the field. But as you can imagine, and as you see by how many partner organizations were involved in this project, collecting that evidence is a serious undertaking, of parallel levels of effort to, let's say a phase 3 trial or multiple trials. And so it is a huge achievement and is really important for the field. And if you jump on one more, I'll go through this last one very quickly because I'm sure Megan is going to talk about it a lot. The last is digital therapeutics. And these are also evidence-based, but these are actually interventional products. And this is the smallest category within digital health, but is definitely going to be a huge part of the future. And we're very excited about the capabilities in this area, because oftentimes digital therapeutics help us intervene with things that pills can't reach or not currently, right? So these are often developed, for example, in parallel with a drug intervention, and are either improving outcomes in that space or are treating, as I say, aspects of a disease that the pill can't reach. And I give one example here, a very famous example on the next slide of Reset. And so here is people who are dealing with opioid use disorder. This was the first approved reimbursed digital therapeutics available on the market from a company called Pear. And the app, through its through its monitoring and feedback was shown to improve outcomes. And they've since gone on to apply this same approach in a number of different other indications. But I don't want to go into this too much because I want to hand back to Megan, who's going to talk a lot more about this. Jump on to the next slide. I think that's it. Yes.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that background. And it was a really cool time when Dime worked together with DTA to really create those initial 3 levels of what is digital health versus medicine and therapeutic. It's still one of more of the popular perspectives that is visited on our website, just talking about those notions. So I appreciate the introduction. And let's jump into a little bit of DTA now. So looking at DTA, the next slide shows a little bit of who we are. We are a nonprofit trade association. Our entire goal really is to help bring clarity to the end users. So patients, clinicians, payers, and regulatory agencies. How do we actually help them recognize what a digital therapeutic is, evaluate them, and then utilize them in practice? So DTA, we have about 80 member companies across 18 countries. The next slide is just a way to show that what we're doing has an international focus. We really want to ensure if one country has a way of recognizing a digital therapeutic, that the same level of quality and rigor is recognized across all countries. So what we're doing is very global in nature. A lot of our work is focused North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific at the moment. So with that, the next area just really talks a lot about this idea. Why does this even matter? And I think this was already discussed really well before, so I won't spend much time here. But the ideas of not all medications that come in the same color are the same, therefore not all digital products are the same. And Yayan did a really good job really providing that overview of what the different types of categories are. From a patient perspective, why am I using it? Is it trustworthy? Clinicians, do I need to authorize this? How do I use the data that comes out? Payers, what are we covering and what's the delivery for that? And then regulators, what level of risk does this product have and what is the indication for that purpose? So moving along into this idea, this is not comprehensive. It's something that I created for a report we are doing, but I figured I would include it here. The notion of these different ideas, and I think the initial idea of digital health, medicine, and digital therapeutics is the best way to take away from this entire presentation. This is just one other example, taking it just, I think, a step below that of what are the different types of technologies out there, what are their purposes, indications. The diagnostic and monitoring is very much so a digital medicine component. The therapeutic side, some digital therapeutics is really where we fit. So everything that I'm going to talk about today really does fit in the patient-facing intervention side, in that dark colored blue segment that basically looks black. So we'll work on that next time. So what is a digital therapeutic? We are looking at this as, again, software that is actually delivering a legitimate clinical intervention to a patient. And that intervention itself is going to make the claim to treat, manage, or prevent a disease or disorder. So if you are making these claims, moving to the next slide, you have to be able to prove and back it up. You have to have a rigorous product that has been designed well, that's going to execute well and reliably so over time. So what we've been looking at is if you are a healthcare evaluator, decision maker, clinician, or patient, if you are presented with a digital therapeutic product or any product that's claiming to be so, how do you actually assess, is this a DTX? These are the 10 points that we would recommend starting with. And again, from a patient perspective, it's going to be a little bit more challenging at the moment. And we as an industry are trying our best to really make sure that this is really accessible to patients and clinicians. But the ideas around a product, making sure that it's making the right claims, that's actually using software to deliver the intervention and generate that intervention, as opposed to a human being the one to make that final decision and then treat the patient. Looking at how is it designed, making sure that end users are involved in every step of the way. Patient privacy and security are incredibly important and should never be overlooked in this industry. And then making sure that all these products have actually done their own clinical trials. So making sure that there is clinical data to back up the claims that the product is making, that's available in peer-reviewed publications. And then the products undergo regulatory oversight. And then the interesting component that we'll touch on a little bit more is this idea that products will actually generate real world data, real world evidence. So getting that sense, I think, is really helpful of understanding how this is all used and how the product itself is performing and how the patient is doing in addition to that. So moving to the next, digital therapeutics. They are designed to touch on a wide variety of indications. So this isn't just a small, narrow subset of products. This is really looking at this idea around both behavioral health conditions, chronic conditions, and in addition to comorbidities of different issues and conditions. So this is a list. It needs to be updated, but it touches on a variety of topics that DTX products were being developed for or were already on the market for back when I created this in 2020. So it's hopefully giving you a sense, though, the broader spectrum of issues and indications we're really looking at. When we move along, products from digital therapeutic perspectives, they have what is in the medication world also referred to as a mechanism of action. How are they actually achieving their treatment and their ability to impact a patient? So there are these notions where digital therapeutics will deliver a disease treatment, management, or prevention program. They will also, as I mentioned before, address comorbidities and side effects of different conditions. The notion that digital therapeutics can now actually directly produce a direct neurologic change in a patient is really a great innovative step that this industry has taken. Additionally, the notion of similar to Pear's product Reset that was discussed, delivering cognitive behavioral therapy to a patient, enhancing in-person or medication treatments, and then also this notion of responsive physical exercise and behavioral intervention. So these are just some examples of the mechanisms that digital therapeutics use to actually deliver their intervention. From a benefit standpoint, when you're looking at this from a patient perspective, it's different. You could be authorized a digital therapeutic by your employer, by a payer of some sort, or written a prescription by your clinician. So what's the value from a patient perspective? A lot of the value points are listed here, but what I really think is of interest is that digital therapeutics are really intended to meet the patient needs. So the idea of a digital therapeutic can be used possibly on a patient's own phone. It could be used then on the patient's own time, in the comfort of their own environment. It's usually really intended to be engaging and deliver meaningful interaction with the patient. Speaking a patient's language is important for a digital therapeutic. Obviously, that's different from a traditional medication. So while they are intended in many ways to fall in line with a patient's clinical paradigm and the treatment pathway they're on, they add in a different nuance here that traditional medications can't do, but then they also have another nuance of being really adapted to a patient's own environment and having to deliver a therapy in the patient's understanding. So moving along to the clinician perspective, the idea that these products can actually deliver outcomes, so real world data points and real world evidence points that a clinician can actually take action on. This is one of the first times that I'm aware of, at least, that a therapy itself can directly tell a clinician, this is how the patient is trending. These are the outcomes that we've been seeing. So a clinician can then make the decision to scale up or scale back different aspects of a patient's therapy based upon the actual therapy's outcome, which I think is a really encouraging aspect that the industry will only continue to build on, again, in alignment with the privacy and security requirements that digital therapeutics are subject to. So utilization is a really important step. So the idea from a medication standpoint, it's, again, as a pharmacist for my background, you're looking at, let's make sure we use the right drug for the right patient at the right time and other conditions apply. Same idea applies to digital therapeutics. Is it the right indication? Is it the right patient for the right therapy? The notion that you're using a digital therapeutic for a specific duration of time, for specific indication is really important. But then again, those ideas that we've discussed already, that DTX products are able to generate a lot of data. And if that data is used well, you can start to identify, is this actually the right outcome we're looking for? Is this the right response to therapy? And then how are we actually evaluating this to make sure that we're looking at the entirety of a patient's therapy and overall treatment paradigm, not just how the DTX product itself is performing? So I wanted to make these ties. I think it's important to realize that DTX products are used alongside of medications, sometimes even in place or even before medication. So there's a lot of ways that these are going to overlap with a patient's therapy. So having insights is going to be really critical every step of the way. So moving along, the notion here of some ideas we've already spoke to. So the ideas where there's some similarities and then where there's some implications. The timing and frequency of when these evaluations are done. The applicability of really making sure that these are engaged in the entirety of how a patient's not only doing, but how is that health economic perspective evolving too. So there's a lot of considerations that are listed here, and it's been an interesting way just to see this idea that digital therapeutics are iterative in how they are developed. So they undergo clinical trials, but as they evolve, as different fixes, patches, and bugs are addressed, and as real-world data is applied back to the product to enhance it and improve it, how does that impact a patient's journey? How does it impact a clinician's engagement with it? Those are questions that we're still working through and really are trying to have with patient communities to see how this evolution occurs and how we can best engage with it. So just want to quickly touch on other ideas before we move along, or as we move along into the Q&A segment. But ideas on the next slide. Digital therapeutics in the United States are regulated at a variety of different levels. Just at least wanted to draw attention to the fact that the FDA has established a digital health center of excellence, and digital therapeutics have really started to be recognized under this center, and there's a lot of evolution underway in that process. But right now, I can at least with confidence say that digital therapeutics have pathways to market as they stand, generally recognized as medical devices. There's nuances we can get into later around enforcement discretion and other subcategories, but at least market access in the United States is very much available. The next slide, however, is a little bit trickier. So from a government standpoint, digital therapeutics do not currently have a benefit category under Medicare. So that leads us into some questions about how are these going to be reaching patients. At this point on the next slide, we'll see that digital therapeutics are starting to be included as an example in digital health formularies. So by and large in the United States, patients that have coverage on the private side of the health insurance system are more likely to have coverage and access to a digital therapeutic, whereas those under Medicare, Medicaid are less likely at this point, given the legislative structure that doesn't quite exist yet for Medicare to recognize and provide access. So this is something that I think is interesting from a policy perspective and also just a broader recognition. In other countries, there are other pathways. So Germany has a pathway that digital therapeutics can get to market for the entirety of the population. The UK has a different pathway. France is developing one. South Korea has a pathway. So United States has been a long leader in the regulation side, but on this side of the payment side, it's still something that is definitely evolving. So the last slide before we go to Q&A is some of the work here we're doing with this idea around consistency. So the idea of let's try to create a consistent way. So if a payer, an employer, a decision maker of any sorts wants to actually engage with digital therapeutics and bring them into a market, how do they approach that? So DTA is working on this notion around let's create that on-ramp to at least start that conversation around what is good, what does a onboarding process potentially look like, and how do we help decision makers really approach this new category. I know Dime is working on another variety of issues that touch on ideas just like this. So happy to discuss more of this, but that's at least a quick overview of what is going on in the industry, how to approach these products, and then where the current landscape is in terms of access and evolution of really next steps to patient care. So with that, I will turn it back over to Elizabeth.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you, for your presentations. For folks on the line, you're welcome to put any questions that you have in the chat, and we can get to those. I guess I wanted to go through, just for my own internal learning, sort of the three definitions that we talked about, and then review with you both that I've gotten it correct. So we've got digital health, and this is sort of this umbrella. It's a broader definition, and that would include things like lifestyle apps. Maybe my Fitbit would fall under that kind of an umbrella. It would be also in terms of remote monitoring as part of a clinical trial, that might fall into this umbrella of a digital health tool as well. Okay.
Exactly. It's you know, where something has not yet been necessarily validated to improve your health in a clinical setting.
Okay, so it's collecting data from me and it might be helpful, but it's not at this next layer, which would be digital medicine. And this is our first layer where it's really evidence-based, meaning that there's been studies to validate that these software and then the hardware products that go alongside it, and these would measure or intervene in the service of human health. Can you walk us through one more example of what, you know, a digital medicine that folks on the line might be familiar with?
Trying to think of a good example. Trying to think one that people might have heard of.
Or even one that folks might not have heard of, but it's, again, you know, just an example that illustrates this next layer from the maybe Apple Watch that we're familiar with.
Sure. Okay, so maybe one like a good one that maybe people might be familiar with is the idea of a decision support tool.
Mm-hmm.
So this is, for example, something that helps doctors reach a conclusion, right? So it might be a diagnostic tool, or, you know, providing the correct medication to an individual, or, you know, reaching out to somebody at the right time. And so there are many early phase digital medicine applications in that kind of area. That's one of the areas that people think the digital medicine tools will have a big impact, again, because a lot of these tools are becoming increasingly part of our everyday lives. If we can use that data to, for example, recognize when somebody may be likely to, you know, be diagnosed with a condition, or have an event or an exacerbation coming up, you know, using that data to kind of help the doctor reach out to them and make that decision is a very common area for digital medicine.
So that's actually perfect then. Do you mind, Elizabeth, if I take that to the next step, to the therapeutic side? So that idea of a clinical decision support is, again, providing the clinician with that decision-making capability, but validated evidence so they can make that decision well. I think the digital therapeutic component of it would be that digital therapeutic takes into consideration all these factors and then makes that decision and intervention itself. So clinicians can prescribe these as products and work alongside of them. So we're not talking about just saying a DTX is going to replace a clinician, but I think it is something of that. I think hopefully that usually clicks in people's minds of, oh, it's actually making that its own intervention and going straight to the patient directly, as opposed to saying, dear clinician, what would you do with this next, for the clinician to make that decision.
Exactly. So both things are improving outcomes. It's just that in one case, the clinician is making the decision, the actual medical intervention, and for digital therapeutics, it's the app itself is making that intervention.
That's really helpful. A question from Kevin is, could you talk a bit more about the regulatory challenges in terms of ensuring safety and effectiveness of the tool, as well as post-market surveillance for its ongoing safety and effectiveness? And then could you also speak about the thresholds for demonstrating value for the product?
Maybe I'll take a first cut at this. So sticking in the area of digital therapeutics, there's been a really interesting development in the last year or two in Germany, where they've basically created exactly what you're talking about, right? Otherwise you get this chicken and egg situation, right? You know, it's not on the market, so you can't collect the data, but without the data, you can't put it on the market, right? And so what they've done in Germany is create what they're calling like a sandbox system, where you can put a digital therapeutic onto the market for a period of 1 year as kind of a precursor, where you can collect that data. And if at the end of that year, or any period during that year, you can demonstrate value, and value is as for any drug or any interventional product, is very broadly defined. That might be increasing engagement very simply, because that is shown to improve outcomes. It might be reducing medical cost usage, and so on, right? Value, those value discussions are extremely complex. But this pathway effectively allows people to put a digital therapeutic onto the market, collect that evidence, and if at the end of that year, as I say, they can actually demonstrate value, it then becomes an official product on the market and can be prescribed by physicians in Germany.
And yeah, what's fun about that is now France has said we want to do exactly the same thing too, and they're trying to go live in the next bit of time, which is really exciting to see more of that evolve. I think from the DTX perspective, just sticking to that notion, back in the United States side, they undergo reviews for the higher level risk products by the FDA for both safety and efficacy. So those two areas are evaluated, and usually clinical trials are involved in it, especially sorry to go a little nerdy here, but there's different pathways. And if you do a de novo pathway, which is loosely akin to like a brand pathway, you have to submit a full RCT and a full clinical trial. If you do a 510K, which loosely, for anyone who's regulatory, feel free to provide more details on this later too, but it's more that idea of we are equivalent to this other product. So different levels of studies are provided. From the DTX perspective though, again, that ongoing evidence is really important for that product to keep looking at the product performance and also the clinical outcomes, and then making sure that's iterating appropriately. So there is a lot of focus within the industry on that effectiveness side in real world settings also.
That's really helpful. I think one of the areas that I find fascinating in digital therapeutics and digital medicine is that I suppose we have clinical trials, but then one of the strengths is that as the applications are being used, they also improve because the algorithms improve. So could you speak a little bit about how the clinical trials that might be done in a regulatory sense or even a post-marketing sense, how is that continuously monitored, and perhaps building on the German example, and everybody can take a look. The link is shared in the chat as well.
So I'm happy to at least try, and then feel free to jump in. I think when you're looking at the regulatory side, regulatory for a lot of these entities is just a baseline requirement. So you have to do whatever clinical trials you need to get your FDA clearance as a device. That said, though, when you start to go to individual payers and health systems and clinicians and other groups like that, that's when a lot of other requirements come into play for the randomized controlled trials and for higher levels of evidence and ongoing impact. So it's not as simple as we're just going to go and get our FDA clearance and that's that. It's if you want your product to have market access and be utilized and even eventually included into clinical guidelines, because that's the directionality of the field eventually, then what are those studies that even go possibly above and beyond what initial safety and efficacy trial would be? So there are a lot of conversations right now about what that is. One of my questions, again, is what is a sufficient amount and type of clinical trials for digital therapeutics? On the drug side, it's very clear of if you're going to apply, this is what you need every step of the way, and that's accepted. Here, it's not as well defined. So there's a lot of requests coming from a lot of players since there just isn't this notion yet. So I think our industry really needs to work together with the clinical groups to really understand, and payers, what is the sufficient number and type of clinical trials above and beyond, or in addition to a safety and efficacy baseline.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you put your finger on a key point here, is that sort of traditionally the development of the tool and that initial registration requires very different evidence to what the actual market requires. So in particular, like payers and that kind of thing. And this has always been very much kind of a dissociated process, both within the pharma industry and more broadly. You kind of you do one and then you start working on the next. And of course, this is very slow and delays medicines coming to people and actually reaching the people in the market. And so what is happening these days is that there's a lot of collaboration, for example, between the FDA or the EMA and payer organizations, so that there is at least parallel consultation with those two communities, and then they're not done linearly. But increasingly, there's also efforts to, for example, streamline the kinds of evidence that might be required, or efforts, for example, by pharmaceutical companies to include sort of market relevant data collection also in earlier phases of clinical development. So this might be a little bit more effort earlier on, but it saves a lot of time over the whole process.
Thanks. And we're nearly at time, so this will probably be our last question. But for a question from Chantal is, if you could speak a little bit more about the FDA's digital health software pre-certification or pre-cert program, where it stands as well as the potential.
So I think it's, for those who are not familiar with it, think of it like a TSA pre-check program, where if you get certified, you do not need to take off your shoes and you can keep your laptop in your bag when you're going through the next phases of regulatory review for the product. It makes complete sense. So there's a lot of potential for it. I personally, and I'd be happy to hear others' thoughts on it, it still is very much a pilot phase. So any product that has gone through it is just a pilot product review, but they've also had, any practice also have to undergone the full regulatory review pathways at the same time. So there's been a parallel process to test the pilot, but every product has still undergone the full FDA review authorization process. I think that COVID probably took a little bit of steam out of it just because there's so many other priorities the FDA was focused on. I haven't heard the next steps about it, but I'm not sure if Yayan, if you've heard more about than I have. So I know it's still alive and active, but when it's going to make its debut or next steps, I don't know that.
Yeah, I don't think they've made any kind of timelines public, but yeah, again, you hit the nail on the head, right? I mean, if you think about it from the perspective of the people who are developing these tools, it's extremely risky to kind of develop it and then go to the regulators and be like, what do you think? Because maybe they're like, well, you haven't collected the right evidence, or I don't like this at all, or you've forgotten something. And so what the pre-cert program is, and there's equivalent sort of pathways also in the European Medicines Agency, where and regulators are extremely consistent about this. Like, they want you to engage with them as early as possible. And in fact, recently they've even been going one further and organized a whole series of activities around what they're calling patient-centered drug development. And so this means they're working directly with patient advocates in order, in sort of priority areas, to really like put forward what needs to be done and what needs to be collected, and the tools that are missing, and the medical needs and the kind of evidence that they want to see. And this is kind of a new development for the FDA, because, as I say, sort of innovation, they've often been accused of being kind of a brake on the system, right? That they're not encouraging innovation, that they're the naysayers, right? And so what they're really trying very hard to do is to create these pathways so that people can engage with them, because they're always saying, engage with us early, and then developers are like, how? And so what they want to do is create these programs so that people can talk to them as early as possible, and they can provide guidance as early as possible. And so it means that exactly as Megan was saying, when you actually get to that big discovery and that big conversation with the regulators, everything is already in place, and everybody's familiar with what evidence is going to be presented, and everybody knows the product, and hopefully it's a much more smooth experience rather than kind of last minute left turns and surprises.
Well, this was super. I definitely learned a lot from both of you and really appreciate you joining us. Just a reminder for folks on the line, we are going to have another 2 webinars in this series. Next week, we'll have mHealth and examples of patient community engagement, where we will be going along this exact same topic, where we'll be highlighting 2 examples of patient community involvement in developing a mobile app. And then after that, we'll have a discussion about digital health and health equity. So we'll be posting on the website the resources that were linked in today's webinar. And then we're also going to be linking to a couple of other resources from NHC members, including AMCP, which has been working very closely also with the Digital Therapeutics Alliance on much of this work. So encourage you to check out all of those resources. And we're really, again, thankful to both of you, Megan and to Yayan, for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful evening and look forward to chatting again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Take care.